Globalization is the idea of bringing people together, people and nations of the world together for the benefit of them all. In this segment, I'd like to share with you the different approaches to globalism. Globalism as a field of study basically has its roots in 1970s, where different institutions began this discipline in different fields like political science and economics and management, marketing, and elsewhere as a separate field of study. And in 1970s, I also received a certification while pursuing my doctorate in the field of global policy studies at the University of Georgia. And then before that, I worked for 3 multinational firms, US-based multinational firms, which produced and sold their products in various corners of the earth. And then during 2000s, late 1990s and 2000, I coordinated a series of seminars on globalism at the institution where I worked. Since I retired, I have conducted many seminars on the question of globalism. Now, although globalization deals with the spread of education, science, technology, healthcare, communication, trade, investment, finance, the question of refugees and refugee resettlement, human rights, the question of global police force, culture, ecology, environment, population, energy, food, water, peace and security in general, and the like, many observers think that it is primarily an economic and trade issue. Now, based on almost half a century of involvement with global issues and my keen interest in globalism, I have been able to identify basically 9 approaches to globalism, which are as follows. 1, what is called free market globalization. 2, justice globalization. 3, unilateral, what I call cowboy globalization. 4, political globalization. 5, jihadist globalization. 6, Armagaden globalization. 7, dictatorial or KKK globalization. 8, anti-globalization, which is also a force dealing with global issues. And finally, the World Order of Baha'u'llah. In these segments, I will discuss briefly these 9 approaches to globalization. 1, what I indicated is the free market globalization, which takes its origins from the 18th century economist thoughts Adam Smith, who advocated the idea of laissez-faire. Let the market be the deciding factor with regard to what to sell, how much to sell, what to produce, how much to produce, what quality to produce, and let the government have their hands off in not interfering with the market forces. And then ultimately the market will make the best decision with regard to pricing, product production, distribution, selling price, and so on. And by extension, the idea is to allow free and unhindered trade to flourish all across the globe. In this manner, it is believed, those who deserve would stay in business, and those who don't will basically go out of business. This approach may also be linked to what is termed as unbridled capitalism: land, labor, management, and resources brought together for the maximization of profit for the owners. The proponents of this approach further believe that this approach in a competitive environment would result in innovations, further efficiencies, lowering of costs, and provision of the best products for the consumers. These ideals came to total fruition by the advocacy and authorship of a brilliant Nobel Peace Prize winner, Milton Friedman, in late 1970s and 1980s. Now, Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom and President Ronald Reagan of the United States, through massive deregulations, loss of oversight, and lowering of taxes for the very rich, were proponents of this approach. Now, in the early debates of another presidential candidate initially competing with Ronald Reagan, George Bush called this voodoo economics. But later, of course, he became the vice president, running with Ronald Reagan. Others refer to this approach as trickle-down economics, the idea being that give the most to the rich, and that eventually everyone will benefit because they will produce jobs and would invest the money, and as a result many people would get employed, and everyone would benefit from this approach. Now, another presidential candidate from the 1980s, from what I remember, was Jesse Jackson, who called this the process of taking from the needy and giving it to the greedy, was his words. Other policy implications of this approach was to further suppress the lower class in society, at least temporarily, until this idea flourishes and the masses benefit. And then also ignoring the demands of the world and other Western democracies for more effective environmental regulations and legislation. Then it eventually also led to massive frauds because of deregulation and availability of funds for the super rich by the billionaires in Enron and WorldCom, and a number of other companies, and an additional suffering of the masses. Now, any move to adjust these extremes were viewed as communistic, socialistic, and un-American by many. And then finally this led, together with many other things, led to the recession of 2008. Now, milder proponents of globalism and globalizations who take note of the need to care for the environment and provide a safety net for the workers and refugees and protection of jobs, or at least retraining when the jobs are shipped overseas, and then taking care of the elderly through Social Security and Medicare and the rest. They may be considered as perhaps Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, and Vice President Al Gore, then Bill Gates, and Alan Greenspan, and the famous New York Times editor Thomas Friedman, who wrote bestsellers like The Lexus and the Olive Tree and The World is Flat. Now, the extremes of market globalism, what I explained, may work in a perfect world where there is no corruption, people and companies can be trusted, there is an absolutely high level of honesty, and there is a common set of laws of behavior across the globe in dealing with violators and for protection of workers on a fairly uniform basis. The second approach to globalism is referred to as justice globalism. Now this approach, which is promoted very much by congressmen like Kucinich, and particularly by Ralph Nader, the untiring consumer advocate, and many European politicians and European academics and so on, in Europe and elsewhere. Now they contend that a more balanced view to development, workers' rights, displacement or replacement of workers, curbing the abuses of multinational firms who take advantage of lax labor laws, and then they move their operation elsewhere wherever it's cheaper and it's easier to operate. And then they suggest that we have to curb the appetite of the super rich and take care of the needy among us, and create a balance, a symbol of balance in this respect, and provide the means for equity and justice across the globe. Now, justice globalists want more protection for the workers who are displaced where they lose their jobs, and they promote the idea of retraining of the workers, and then they also want to promote lower taxation for those in need, and then high taxation for those who can afford it, to be able to pay for the services that the government provides. They point out that leaving the workforce dangling here and flying off for better pastures where there's little laws or no laws for their protection is unfair and inhuman. They also point out to the unconscionable widening of the gap between the rich and the poor within countries and across the globe, and point out that this could further lead to instability and civil wars within countries and then across the world among nations. And then they indicate that this idea of dictating to the poor countries that they have to balance the budget and no deficit financing is allowed in order for them to be able to pay off their loans, or at least pay the interest on the loans, money borrowed from World Bank, and then impose those rules on them, and then as a result they become poorer and poorer. Now, justice globalism is also closer to Keynesian approach to economics and governmental intervention, which has led to huge governmental programs and in many countries huge governmental deficits, including in this country, from Social Security to Medicare and Medicaid and many other entitlements which are popular to get and then but very difficult to curb or to lower. Now, the unbalanced approach to these entitlements threatens to destabilize the nations and the world as well. But of course, the approach has many merits of equity and justice. Now, the third approach may be called as unilateral globalism. We may be familiar with the ideas promoted, particularly in early 2000s in this country and perhaps in other parts of the globe, and that was the unilateral approach to global issues, to trade, to environment, to the question of war and war making. You know, the idea was promoted of calling the idea of preemption and first strike. Whoever we think is enemy, will go after them. We're not going to wait for United Nations or any other authority to tell us what to do. We'll do it because we can do it. Now, this approach, of course, was promoted by the Bush-Cheney Rumsfeld group between 2001 and 2008 in the United States. And this approach was extended toward on the question of energy and environment and war and trade and other issues as well. Now, the benefits of such an approach is that there's less bureaucracy, there's less worry about going to different places and spending a lot of money and time to prove your point, and this results in faster decision making, and then hopefully for protecting Americans against further terrorist attacks in the homeland, and the feeling of being in charge and being masters of the universe, and thus not needing consultation or accountability to anyone and anywhere. Such efficiencies should be, would be most cost efficient and less bureaucratic as well. Now, the downside is that it creates extreme alienation across the globe and creates long-term problems and will have long-term consequences for costly decisions that may not be considered seasoned and even moral in the long run. The next approach is often referred to as Jihadist globalism, and this refers to the retaliatory and sporadic approaches of terrorists such as Bin Laden enterprise or rogue nations such as those of Taliban in Afghanistan. Their grievance seems to be with the West in general, in that their way of life has been disrupted, a Western style of life has been imposed on them, although they routinely use the media and telephone and wireless, cell phones and so on, to communicate their message to others. And then they complain that dictators have been propped up by Western powers and they have been imposed on them. And then Western products and ammunition have been sold to them in exchange for oil, which was taken almost for free until World War II, and for a price that benefits an elite few after that time period in the Middle East and elsewhere. Now, after the defeat and pullout of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, with the help of the United States, in 1980s, Taliban and their Arab allies, Bin Laden and company, they found a breeding ground to experiment their Puritan religious beliefs and mores and practices in running that poor country. And what that meant was closing of all the girls' schools, stoning many hapless women on allegation of adultery and other things on a daily basis, and cutting people's hands and feet on charges of robbery, and in brief, creating a condition of absolute terror across that land for over a decade, and bringing the nation to a point of standstill and dark ages until the event of September 11, 2001, and the routing out of Taliban and Bin Laden terrorists, which is not over yet. It continues until today, and that's almost a decade. Now, variations and milder versions of this extreme way of thinking, or at least in dictatorship, have been practiced in the Middle and Near East for the last 200 years. And we see its other manifestations in terrorism, dictatorship, subjugation of women, suppression of any form of dissent, with imprisonment, torture, and execution of opponents in different countries, particularly Middle Eastern countries and some African countries, the prime examples of which were Saddam Hussein of Iraq and now Gaddafi of Libya. as other perpetrators of this system. The next approach to globalism is what I call Armagaden globalism. This is the counterpart to the extremists in the Middle East. In the West, where some fundamentalists believe that Islam, and particularly Islam in this extremist sense, has to be defeated, and Western values and Western way of life has to dominate the whole globe. And then they sincerely believe that through their practice of their way of thinking, that they would be the ones who will be saved, who will go to heaven and dominate the heaven, and then everyone else is doomed to perish and go to hell. Now, because of the maturity of Western democracies and because of the open debates, these fringe groups perhaps will never be able to dominate any of these Western societies. At least that hasn't been the case in the past 50 or 60 years after World War II. Now, another counterpart to the extremist group in the Middle East are the Shia fundamentalist extremists, who believe that they have a mandate from God, that they have to first purify that region, and then after that, then they'll be able to spread that way of thinking across the globe. And so they would, in order to be able to dominate their way of life and their way of thinking, they would beat people, they would lash them in the streets so that others would see. They would go to houses and probe into people's way of living. They mandate people what to dress and how to dress, women and recently even men, and then they basically dominate the thoughts and the way of thinking, and the deviators are punished in different ways, including torture and rape and cutting people's hands and feet for violations, perhaps robbery of some kind or accusations of different kinds, and execution in the most horrendous manner. They have been able to dominate and have that approach and that way of life for the last 3 or 4 decades in some part of the region, and then we'll have to see what the future will bring with regard to these extreme views. The seventh approach is what I call political globalization, which is basically the phenomena of the United Nations, who have been able to bring together political groups, that is governments, from across the globe, and these governmental groups in the General Assembly to sit down and in a civilized manner discuss the issues. And the hope is to avert wars in particular among nations, or to be able to at least monitor in some cases where war is not avoided, and to be able to use UN force as the peacekeeping force when the war is and hostilities have ended. They also try to monitor the behavior of transnational corporations across the globe, and they monitor the question of human rights and the violation of human rights in many of these countries, particularly the dictatorial regimes. And they also educate people with regard to family planning and child care and many other issues, and particularly on the education front. And so they're doing a lot of good things, but UN does not have a powerful police force and perhaps inadequate funding, and so they do what they can, but they have not been able to solve many of the world's problems, particularly the hostilities and wars and civil wars, which so many of them have occurred. after the formation of the United Nations in 1945. But in UN has also, there are many non-governmental agencies who help and cooperate with the United Nations, and hopefully they will also be able to alleviate some of these problems in the long run. Now, the eighth group that I've listed is what I call anti-globalists or isolationists. There are some politicians who say that we have had enough of involvement in all these wars and even in helping other groups and other nations across the globe, and that is perhaps enough, and we need to take care of our own problems and leave all this aside. Now this, perhaps Pat Buchanan, a previous presidential candidate, and Ron Paul, a congressman from Texas, could be examples of this group and this way of thinking. Again, this is particularly because of the recent wars and hostilities that has virtually bankrupted the government here in the U.S. It's quite a force, and they have a point of not wanting any more involvement of any kind. And on the question of trade, they have different way of thinking and different thoughts. In one way they want the free trade, in the other way they want to protect the workers and people here, which can also be understood. And so that is their approach. The ninth approach to globalism is the World Order of Baha'u'llah. The foremost teaching of the Baha'i faith is oneness of the humankind. And in order to reach that point, the Baha'i faith suggests, first and foremost, independent search for truth. Humanity has reached the age of maturity, and we don't have to depend on whoever tells us. Rather, we should search for truth for ourselves. And if we independently search, the founder of Baha'i faith says that we will all reach the same conclusion. We may have different views, but the overall basic truths are one and the same, and we reach to that conclusion. Second, promotion of democracy and freedom across the globe, now that democracy is spreading. And in that manner, people would feel at ease and would be able to accomplish a lot more if they live in a free society. Three, unfettered communication. Now that the internet has become possible, and there's Facebook and Twitter and email, we should be able to communicate without fear of reprisal and be able to communicate across the globe. And with that, we should be able to promote a global language, an international language, in addition to our mother tongue, so that we can all communicate with one another. And if we can communicate, there will be less hostility and there will be more understanding. Next is creation of a loose federation of nations, so that, similar to United States of America or European Union, where different states who have common interests, in addition to their own legislature and executive and judicial branch, they also would have it on a regional basis. So Baha'i suggested we should have it on a global level, so that that group would be able to monitor global security and more equitable distribution of resources across the globe, and making sure that human rights are respected and things which are common value for humanity. And then Baha'i faith also suggests proper and equitable distribution of wealth, so that the extremes of wealth and poverty would go, because those would also lead to instability in different regions. And then promotion of global education, so that the best of the best that humanity has had to offer across the globe, across the ages, from Socrates and Plato to Rumi and Hafez and Sana'i and Omar Khayyam and Shakespeare and Voltaire. These are the treasures of the world that needs to be shared across the globe. And the more we share these treasures in a global educational system, the better harmony and understanding there will be in the world. Baha'i faith also suggests that the myopic way of thinking of nationalism and racism and sexism must give way to a global way of thinking. Baha'u'llah says this span of the earth is one country and mankind is citizens. And so we have to think in those terms. We need to think of different races as our brothers, and we need to think in terms of equality of men and women. And when that is achieved, there will be a lot more accomplishment in the world of humanity. And then we have to promote a mindset of peace rather than war and war making. We need to think of Department of War, Department of Defense in different countries as a police force, so that to maintain order within societies rather than to be a means of aggression to go on and invade other countries. And then Baha'i faith suggests promotion of science for the progress of the humankind rather than for becoming self-serving, and that is another issue that needs to be discussed at length. And then promoting harmony and oneness of religion across the globe. Ultimately, though, Baha'u'llah teaches us it is through our personal discipline in how we conduct ourselves and how we internalize the teachings of the faith and how we treat one another and how we learn to consult, respect, and associate with one another with the discipline in being loyal to the administrative order of the faith, which teaches us this way of consultation and harmony among ourselves and in our dealing with our fellow man, that we shall be able to influence the world for the better and to promote peace on earth and become agents of peace ourselves and collaborating with all those who work on peace on earth.